Well, thank you all again for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Advancing Indoor Air Quality Strategies in Residential Building Design. My name is Chris. I'm the Associate Director here at the PHRC. So we're going to kind of work through the what is indoor air quality and what can we do as professionals in the residential industry to provide the end user or the occupant with, kind of the best shot for having good quality indoor air. This description, all of the handouts or the handouts for this presentation is posted on the website. So you can download that, and this description and learning objectives are also in that handout. So, but really quick here, if you've ever attended any of my sessions, you know that I really like to highlight in red some key things that key points that I want to get across. So this session introduces a structured approach to indoor air quality, or IAQ, planning and residential design tailored for us here in Pennsylvania and the climate here in Pennsylvania, along with some other things that are not specific to Pennsylvania, but have a really big impact on buildings here in Pennsylvania for indoor air quality. And we'll get to that here in a minute. This session also emphasizes practical strategies to promote healthier, safer, and more comfortable living environments. If we were going to go in depth on all of those, this would be a much longer than a 1 hour session. So we're going to kind of highlight these. I'll touch base on a couple previous programs, whether they were webinars or Hankin speakers, their lecture, that have kind of gone in depth a little bit more on some of these, just to provide some additional resources. So looking at our learning objectives here, we want to assess occupant health concerns, respiratory conditions, and some chemical sensitivities that some may have. You may not be aware of some of them, and maybe some of them you are aware of, but knowing where they come from and how to potentially mitigate some of their concerns, we'll talk about that here today. We'll also identify some common indoor pollutant sources. Again, if we were going to dive into the full depth of those pollutant sources, we would be here for the next 3 days. I'm sure a lot of you have way more interesting and fun things to do other than to tune in to this. So we'll try to keep it highlighted and direct. We'll also evaluate the trade-offs between health-driven IAQ design features. This is not necessarily saying that you can cut corners. That's not what I'm getting at here when we're talking about trade-offs. We're looking at different strategies or different approved approaches and looking at a potential good, better, best approach on some of those items. Primarily, we're probably going to look at for this specifically is going to be whole house mechanical ventilation. And then the last one here is implement client-centered IAQ design processes through support decisions or while supporting decisions that improve long-term air quality, comfort, and wellness, right? Ultimately, we are in the industry to provide a home, a living space for occupants. I've said this multiple times that our job is to provide the best end product that we can for the budget that the consumer has, right? We have to understand that we can't install the absolute cream of the crop system for everybody because not everybody can afford it, but we should still make sure that we provide them with the best quality we can for their budget. So, why indoor air quality is a critical design issue? Looking at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or US EPA, they state, there it is, that Americans spend approximately 90% of their time indoors. So, I am going to share the results from the polling. And here we go. We have kind of a mixed group. However, the majority of the folks in attendance here today were calling out for 85%. So you're close, right? They're stating 90%. And many of you that are falling in that 85 to 90% are potentially like, well, Chris, that seems like an awful lot of time indoors. And it does seem that way, right? So if you think about you spending 90% of your time indoors, it seems like a really long or a really large percentage of time. So I sat down and I kind of thought about where do I spend most of my time in during the day? If typically you spend 8 hours a day at work, you spend 8 hours sleeping, you spend a couple hours prepping dinner, eating dinner, cleaning up from dinner, let's say 3 hours watching TV or quiet time or reading or whatever the case may be. That alone gets you to about 88%. So there's 3 additional hours that are hiding there. Where are you those additional 3 hours? Probably also indoors. I also understand that this is going to be different for different people. If you work outside, your indoor percentage is going to be much lower because you're working outside. Um, Depending on your age, your mobility, um, those things come into play as well on how much time you're going to spend indoors. Looking at bullet point number 2 here is indoor air pollutant concentrations are often 2 to 5 times higher. So you're spending way more time in an area that has a much higher concentration of pollutants than you would otherwise. And for those folks that probably need more fresh air or could use a little bit more fresh air, that vulnerable population, whether you're elderly or just, you don't have the mobility, they often spend even more time than 90% indoors. So it's very interesting to kind of look at that percentage and reflect upon yourself on how much time to really spend indoors. Um, it's pretty eye-opening. Get that poll out of my way. The US EPA also goes on to say that indoor concentrations of some pollutants have increased in recent decades due to such factors. And I don't want this to be a trigger for anybody because I know that there are thoughts out there that, well, indoor air quality or the moisture concerns or humidity concerns that we've had or now having are due to the tightness of the homes and the homes need to breathe in quotation marks. So indoor concentrations of some pollutants have increased in recent decades due to such factors as energy efficient building construction. And this is very, very important to understand. It's when it lacks sufficient mechanical ventilations. It's a proven statistic that increasing the energy to increase the energy efficiency, the tighter you make it, that's the most cost effective way to do that, right? But you just can't do half of the equation. There is always a reaction, right? And when you tighten up that building, when you condition that space and you want to keep that space in the conditioned area, therefore you tighten up the enclosure, there's a reaction to that. And that is, well, now you need to get fresh air in. And that's where mechanical ventilation comes into play. So when you have, or when it lacks sufficient mechanical ventilation, it does increase the potential for pollutants. So we have to address that. And I will get into that here a little bit later on. There's also an increased use of synthetic building materials, furnishings, and household cleaners. Again, if you kind of reflect, right, and you take a look at some of the cleaners or agents that you have in your house, a lot of those are synthetic, right? If you take a look at a lot of the building materials now or the building components, they're all synthetic. When it comes to flooring, to cabinets, whatever the case may be, a lot of those items are now synthetic. And with it comes the introduction of certain pollution. So looking at the health, comfort, and performance impacts of indoor air quality, we're going to look at three main things here. First thing is occupant respiratory health. The next one is comfort, and then durability. Okay, we'll kind of address those each individually. I think we could spend a lot of time on the comfort side of things, and there are a lot of webinars that we've done here at the PHRC already that address that. Moving forward, maybe next year during our webinar series, we may transition our indoor air quality or indoor environmental quality from IAQ to potentially looking at thermal comfort as well. But for today's presentation, we are going to give an overview of each of these three directives. So the first one is occupant respiratory health. Some common indoor pollutants in residential buildings. Some of these are probably going to jump out at you as, yeah, definitely can understand how that can be an indoor pollutant. Some of them might be like, well, I haven't thought of that. And that's why we're here today, right? So first and foremost, we're looking at volatile organic compounds or VOCs. I'm sure you have gone through the store, looked at materials or cleaners or other things that say VOC free. Some manufacturers and some products have ventured that direction. However, not all products out there are VOC free. Some building paints, building products and paint products carry with them some VOCs. Formaldehyde is actually a form of a VOC. Furniture itself is not a VOC. However, furniture, carpets, they do off-gas VOCs. And, we'll get into what that means here in a little bit, but we're just kind of doing a 30,000-foot view of some components within residential buildings that bring with it some poor air quality issues or some air pollutants. Asbestos, stale air, moisture, radon. We're going to spend some time on that and many, many more. So if you're not familiar with what a VOC or a volatile organic compound is, they are chemicals that easily become gases and are released from many products such as paints, cleaners, fuels, and other building material products. They're often found in high concentration indoors just because you have a lack of fresh air and circulation and ventilation, and contribute to short-term or acute and potentially long-term or chronic health effects, right? So some common areas within your homes that, or within the construction of a home or existing homes where you can find some VOCs, some materials. Again, we covered some paints and things of that nature, but that also includes some different sealants that you might see, adhesives for different construction practices, composite wood products, and flooring, furniture, and upholstery. Composite wood products, when looking at over the last couple decades, it's difficult to find now, in especially looking at your typical new construction, a lot of solid wood components, right? A lot of the cabinets are not solid wood. A lot of the furniture being used now is not solid wood. And when you're bringing those types of materials into the home, that is also bringing with it some indoor air quality issues of pollutants through VOCs. The picture of the dog is not, I would not consider the dog a VOC. However, the carpet that the dog is laying on could potentially be off-gassing some VOCs. Jumping over to the right-hand side, some different activities that could happen inside of homes. Cooking. You may not be thinking that cooking could bring with it some VOCs. However, Sarah Klein-Taub Lowe delivered a webinar many, many years ago. Shoot, I forget what the name of that is. On indoor air quality, healthy home, right? And she actually talked about the different off-gassing or different particles that can come about through cooking. Smoking, obviously, and different hobbies, crafts, things like that. When you're bringing different chemicals into your hobbies, those chemicals or those different adhesives or glues or whatever you may be using for those hobbies or crafts can also be off-gassing or bringing with it some VOCs. Use of storage of chemicals and fuel burning appliances. So how do these VOCs affect us both short term and long term regarding health? So your acute exposures are typically between hours to days, and you can tell when you've been in the presence of VOCs or poor indoor air quality due to some of these items. And I'm sure everybody on the call here uh, can think back to a time where, like, I was in an area and it smelled funny and I got a headache, or my eyes were irritated, or my throat was irritated, one way or the other. It was probably because you were being subjected to VOCs, right? Those acute, once you left the area, those symptoms went away. So that's considered acute exposures, where it's a short-term effect, and once you leave the area of contamination, those reactions subside. Jumping over to chronic exposures, that's years to lifetime. And there we will talk about especially one, potentially two topics here today that fall into the chronic exposure line, right? Where you may not know for sure that you're being exposed to them. So years down the road, that's a chronic exposure, could lead to potential liver and kidney damage, central nervous system damage, and increased cancer risk. So you're exposed to a carcinogen, right? Carcinogen is a substance that may increase your risk to developing cancer, right? So again, kind of breaking these down into two different areas. Once you are exposed to some sort of indoor air quality concern, and then once you leave that, that's an acute exposure, but then you can also have chronic exposures as well. So I mentioned formaldehyde as being a VOC, but maybe everybody is not quite sure what formaldehyde typically or really is. It's a common indoor VOC of concern. Formaldehyde is a colorless chemical with a strong pickle-like odor. I didn't necessarily know that it had the pickle-like odor. However, that is the definition that was provided here. It easily becomes a gas at room temperature, which makes it a larger group of chemicals known as VOCs. Um, when an item gives off formaldehyde, it is released into the air through a process called off-gassing, right? So that chemical is within those building products when exposed to room temperature, in most VOCs, and formaldehyde being one of those, when you increase the temperature and you increase the humidity, it actually increases the off-gassing of that. It makes it more potent. So I do touch on, it's also good to keep the temperature and humidity in check. This also, formaldehyde is classified. It is classified as a known human carcinogen, right? So typical residential sources of formaldehyde or acetaldehyde, pressure pressed wood products and cabinetry. Again, looking back to the cabinets that are installed in most new construction, I completely understand that there are some construction practices out there that are using 100% uh, real wood, and that's fine. But there's a reason why we use cabinets that include this type of material. It's strong, and yet the cost is more in line for what you're going to use for cabinetry. So there are reasons why we use this. However, we just need to be made aware that it does bring with it some risk that does need some additional ventilation until it off-gas its VOCs. The insulation and compressed material or composite materials. I do want to say that I was actually working with a builder this week, and we were looking for basement insulation products. And doing the research, I came across several manufacturers that actually were marketing that their product was VOC free. Okay, so there are VOC free products out there. If that's of interest and you want to make sure that you're providing that type of product to your consumer, please keep that in mind and look for those products that are VOC free. Gas appliances and combustion sources, and some fabrics and furnishings. I do want to tell a quick story. When our kids, my wife and I, when our kids were younger, we did a lot of camping. And when we were doing our shopping for the camper, obviously you have to do that in the dead of summertime, right? And I don't know if any of you here today have went and entered a new camper after it's been sitting on a lot in very high heat without any ventilation. But when we walked in there, it the smell like hit you in the back of the throat. Our eyes immediately started burning. Nose was irritated, and that's due to the formaldehyde and other VOCs along with fire retardants being installed or sprayed onto the fabrics in there. But they're all VOCs, and that is an acute reaction to the VOCs in some fabrics and furnishings. So you may see that or may have that when you walk into a furniture store, for instance, and then again, that's the off-gassing of those VOCs. So different things that you can do to reduce formaldehyde through ventilation and material choices is specify low emitting products or low VOC emitting products. Again, I was just doing a quick search looking for insulation that can be used exposed in the basement and came across several manufacturers that were marketing that their materials were formaldehyde free. Maintaining adequate whole house ventilation, controlling indoor temperature and humidity. As I mentioned earlier, VOCs, the off-gassing of VOCs increase with the increase of temperature and humidity. So keeping those temperatures and humidity in check also keep that off-gassing to a minimum. However, if you're doing some sort of design for certain groups, whether it's elderly or any other demographic that typically likes to have their their indoor temperature at a higher level. I know my mother, for instance, is hitting that range where she likes it extremely hot in the house. Again, if she moved into a new home with all new furniture, that would definitely increase the off-gassing of those VOCs. And then using local exhaust during cooking, as you can see here in the image. Moving on to radon. Now we're transitioning from those indoor pollutants that not intentionally bring in, but you bring in due to building materials, finishes, things of that nature. Transitioning into radon, and now we have uninvited guests, right? Radon enters your home without you bringing it in. And the next slide here is going to touch on how it does get into the home. But if you're again unfamiliar with radon, it's a serious but invisible indoor air hazard. Radon has a colorless, tasteless, and odorless gas that causes lung cancer. That's very, very blunt because it's accurate. Exposure to radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States after smoking, and it's resulted. It can be estimated that 21,000 deaths annually are a result of radon exposure. This is a significant regional risk in Pennsylvania. I know I joked about uninvited guests, but the joking aside, this is a very significant risk in Pennsylvania. Radon does enter the home, through building cracks in the wall, basement floors, and foundations, and other openings. This graphic over here on the right-hand side is from the Utah Radon Services. They actually have a really, really good library of information for them. I know that we also have it here in Pennsylvania, but if you're looking for something and can't find what you're looking for here at the Pennsylvania through the Pennsylvania means, I would encourage you to take a look at the Utah Radon Services. And as this image shows, there are multiple ways where radon can enter the home. But if you had the opportunity to print the handouts or you want to make any note whatsoever, please note the second bullet point that radon enters, it's driven by pressure differences between soil and the building. Okay? It's driven by pressure difference. So when we continue through today's presentation and we're talking about different strategies for different things, let's think about how those strategies can impact the pressure difference and it's working by creating a pressure difference and how that could adversely affect the introduction of radon into the structure. Okay. This image here, it does come from the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is specifically Pennsylvania. We have three different locations or three different potential zones in Pennsylvania when looking at this legend down here. Philadelphia County is the only county in Pennsylvania that falls under the low potential, which is a county that has a predicted average indoor screening level of less than 2 picocuries per liter of radon. So jumping over quick to our text here on the left-hand side, radon gas is measured in picocuries per liter of air. The EPA recommends that you take action, immediately take action to reduce the radon if the results come back from testing at 4 picoliters per liter or greater. Consider similar actions when radon level is between 2 and 4 picocuries per liter of air. So again, let's hop back over to the other side of this slide and look at our orange counties, right? That's, I would say, a third of Pennsylvania, and that's moderate potential. And when they define moderate potential, that's counties that have a predicted average screening level of greater than 2, but less than 4. Remember, the EPA recommends you take action when you're between 2 and 4. So I'm safe to say 99% of the state of Pennsylvania falls in counties that you have a potential where you need to take action for levels of radon. And then roughly the remaining part of the state here in red have a high potential where they have a predicted average indoor screening of greater than 4. I would say that means Pennsylvania is in a high potential for radon impacts with indoor air quality when being tested, right? So it should also be tested. So the good thing is that the 2021 IRC Appendix AF has provisions on how to mitigate radon control or mitigate radon through different radon control measures. However, in Pennsylvania, the appendices are not adopted as required provisions out of the IRC through the Pennsylvania Uniform Construction Code. Okay. So even though it's in there, Pennsylvania does not adopt that and require those provisions or those appendices to be enforced. How going beyond that, there are just over 2,500 municipalities here in Pennsylvania, and each of those municipalities do have the option to have local ordinances. Because there's over 2,500, I don't have that data available. I don't know i- how many, if any, local municipalities have ordinances for the installation of any sort of radon mitigation. But I would check your area. But more importantly, I believe we should reflect, right? So if we are a builder or a designer, even though the code doesn't require it, is that something that we should be considering and installing for our homes that we're building for families, for any sort of remodeling, whatever the case may be? Is that something that we should explore if we're not already? I do know that there are several builders out there that install. Might as well just jump right to the next slide. Install a passive radon system standardly. Um, there are two different ways for mitigation of radon, two different strategies. The first one here is a passive system, which is a sub-slab depressurization, and you're sealing that slab, and then you are any pressure that builds up under that slab is then depressurized by the stack that's installed up through the roof. Um, Again, there are a lot of check boxes that have to occur when this installation happens. We need to make sure that we seal the slab edge all the way around. Any penetration of that slab also has to be sealed, whether it's a sump pit or if it's going to be a crack or any sort of plumbing rough-ins. We need to make sure that they are sealed because the air below is going to move through the path of least resistance. And we want that path of least resistance to be this stack through the roof. If there are some high levels of radon, remember taking action, right? If you're above 4, you need to take that next step. And that is going to an active system, right? A fan assisted system for elevated levels. When looking at the when looking at the builders that are installing the passive system, oftentimes they're installing an outlet in the attic for this centrifugal fan to be installed in line of that stack unit that then draws air from under the slab and exhausts it through the roof. This is not isolated to new construction, right? So if we have folks on here that are dealing with existing construction, it's always good to do pre and post testing for radon and other things, and we'll touch on that here in a little bit. But if you do some pre-testing, right? If you're coming in and you're doing some sort of a renovation and those radon levels are high, install this active system. As you can see all the way over here on the right, where the stack will start in the basement and then exit. Oops, sorry about that. Exit through the band joist, and then it runs along the exterior of the home. Now, I will say that it's not going to be the prettiest, right? But needing this is very important, and I think installing it, it's better to be not pretty than, well, the alternative, right? So again, regardless of what you're doing, if you are new construction, if you are existing construction, if you're a remodeler, please take radon seriously. And why are we talking about radon now? Well, wouldn't you know it? National Radon Action Month is January, and we are in January. So, what better time than now to start thinking about radon? And, if you're not currently putting any sort of provisions in for radon now, it might be something to think about, doing as a company, as a standard practice, because it's not a spotty thing in Pennsylvania. It does seem like it is a very, very concerning issue across the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Moving into renovations, for our folks who are doing some remodeling, the disturbing legacy materials, definitely can decrease your indoor air quality. Renovation activities can release previous contaminant pollutants such as lead dust, asbestos fibers, mold spores, and accumulated particles. Um, Looking at asbestos, right? I'm sure many of us have walked on tile floors that were asbestos tile, right? And we weren't worried about that because the asbestos was confined, it wasn't being disturbed. Those of us who have been in older buildings that have steam pipes, oftentimes those steam pipes were wrapped in asbestos insulation, which again, we weren't worried about until it was disturbed. If we're doing remodeling in an older unit, right? Disturbing this material, it could be asbestos. And now we have some potentially some short-term exposure risks to the workers and the occupants. So if it's a whole house renovation, there probably is not going to be anybody living there during the renovation. However, if it's an addition or a small renovation to a kitchen or whatever the case may be, there may still be occupants living in that structure. So it's always important that if there's people living there to reduce the risk of exposure, isolate your area off the best way that you can. Start with poly, sheet goods, hang that up, and then try to seal that to the wall or whatever opening you have the best you can to keep those pollutants in the demolition zone and not into the remainder of the house. That kind of goes without saying, but it's one of those points that I just wanted to be sure I covered. I did talk about testing pre and post, but it's very, very important for two reasons here, right? So if we're doing renovations and we do testing beforehand, if maybe the homeowner's like, I want to increase my energy efficiency. As we touched on earlier, one of the most cost-effective ways to do so is to increase the tightness of the home, right? So if we do a pre-test with a blower door, we know where we're starting from. And then we do a post-test with a blower door. Now we know how much tighter it got, right? The other thing is radon, right? So if we test pre and our radon level comes back at X, by tightening up that home and introducing a strategy for whole house mechanical ventilation, you have the potential to then increase radon levels for two reasons. One, you could be depressurizing the house, which is drawing radon in. And number two is it's tighter now. So you don't have that air exfiltrating through the building envelope like you did before. Therefore, your concentrations are only going to increase. So it's a good idea to do testing sequentially, both pre and post. All right, continuing on into comfort drafts and air movement. So we're jumping outside of the actual pollutants and looking at comfort, draft, and air movement, which can introduce some pollutants, but not necessarily the cause of, or those specifically being pollutants. So, what defines comfort? And I do have the little side note here that comfort is subjective, but does have guidelines. Comfort to me is not temperature comfort for me is different than temperature comfort for my wife, right? I will sit there and comfortably in a t-shirt and jeans, and she'll have a sweatshirt and three blankets on. So again, comfort is a little bit subjective. However, there are guidelines, and ASHRAE does define those thermal comfort guidelines in the heating season in between 68 and 74, the cooling season 73 to 79. Looking at relative humidity, 30% to 60% is kind of that realm of acceptable relative humidity. However, ASHRAE does jump that up to 65. I would be very, not careful, but I would check if you're installing specific finishes, and I'm going to touch on hardwood floor just a little bit here. A lot of hardwood floor manufacturers specify what your relative humidity must maintain at or not exceed for their product warranty to be valid. Okay. And that's not necessarily for just the area in which that product was installed. It also has to do with the space below it as well. So a basement, for instance. Looking at air movement or a draft, as defined by ASHRAE Standard 55-2023, a draft is unwanted local cooling caused by air movement, right? I'm sure everybody here has been at some point like, boy, it's drafty in here. And that's air movement that you don't expect or want to move. ASHRAE limits that to approximately 40 feet per second. Anything below that is typically considered to be okay. Anything above 40 feet per minute, I think I said second, 40 feet per minute, it exceeds their limit for acceptable air movement. And that's again unwanted. That's not talking about air coming out of any sort of forced air heating or cooling system. This is just just movement of air. And if you're wondering what 40 feet per minute equates to, I would say, based on the research that I've done, that's the turbulence that you leave behind when walking, right? So if you're standing still, somebody walks past you and you feel that draft, that's roughly 40 feet per minute. It's enough movement of air that will not typically blow out a candle, but it does make that flame move and flicker side to side. Draft discomfort is most common at the ankle level, and uncontrolled airflow that causes local cooling is not acceptable under this standard. So, where do you get that uncomfortable? Where can you get that uncomfortable feeling of a draft, which is indoor air quality, right? You can get it in two main ways when it comes to the interaction from outside to inside or air movement through that building thermal envelope. Wind-driven pressure differences in air infiltration comes from positive pressure on the windward side of a house. We're looking at this graphic here, wind effect, and negative pressure happens on the leeward side of the house, and that drives uncontrolled air movement through the building enclosure, and from the outside in on one side and the inside out on the other side. That air movement you can feel as a draft. Okay. Um, Looking at the stack effect, this is, more pronounced in taller buildings. So if you're looking at the, second story of a two-story or the third story of a three-story townhouse, or looking at commercial buildings, the higher up you go, the more pronounced stack effect is actually going to have, and that's why you'll see a lot of times you'll have fire doors that not only for fire, but it also helps reduce the stack effect risk in tall buildings. Warm air inherently rises and escapes through the upper level through exfiltration, and that creates infiltration on the lower levels below the neutral pressure plane. Um, Again, because you are creating a depressurization at the bottom due to the pressure at the top, and it's drawing air in through the gaps and cracks at the foundation level or up from the foundation. And if it's an unconditioned basement, then you may have with it foul smells. You could have higher moisture content. There's a whole host of items that can be adverse when looking at the movement of air from outside to in, and through stack effect. So I did have this as a poll earlier on, but it was a little bit clunky, so I pulled that away. And I've talked to many, many people who say that I need to replace my windows because they're leaky. Now, if you are actively feeling air coming around that window when the air is blowing outside, or the wind is blowing outside, yeah, I can be on board with that window leaking. But typically, while windows are often blamed, studies have shown that most air leakage occurs at the transitions, penetrations, and top and bottom plates, right? So in this graphic here, about 41% comes from those areas, while only 10% of your air leakage comes from your windows. You may feel what comes across as a draft from your windows, especially when it's super cold out and warmer inside. It's called a convective loop, right? So your warm air is coming against your cold glass, and then as that cool air drops, you're feeling a draft. And that can sometimes be considered leaky windows when it's actually just air currents moving inside of your home due to change in temperature. So it's very important. I'm going to jump to this next slide to identify your leakage pathways. So if we're looking for drafty areas, if we're looking for areas where, you know, air can be moving that can adversely affect your indoor air quality, you need to identify those pathways, seal those connections between those assemblies, and then perform testing or verify through testing. If you're not familiar with how you can test for air leakage, a blower door test is one of the best ways that you can do so. This quantifies the leakage where, again, in a couple slides here, I'm going to have a link to a webinar that you can go to and watch a portion of it. We prefer you to watch the whole thing, but a portion of it does kind of work through the blower door testing procedure, especially the new procedures for the 2021 IRC as modified by the PAUCC. But looking at a blower door test, you introduce this apparatus into a centrally located door. Um, it has a fan in it and it depressurizes the house, right? So that's drawing air out through that, and then it's drawing air in through all the gaps and cracks through the home. When doing that, you can actually have a smoke stick like this, and when that air is moving through that building thermal envelope, you can see that smoke moving, and that'll identify where your leakiest places are. And then you can address that by air sealing. So testing guides targeted air sealing efforts, right? So you're not just blanketly kind of going through and guessing where your air is leaking. You can do it through testing. So here's the webinar that I briefly discussed. It's understanding and addressing air leakage in attached dwellings. I get maybe you're not into attached dwellings, but you can jump on this and it does go through that blower door testing. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing the link on there. This is on our YouTube channel. And if you want to just watch that small portion on the blower door testing procedures, they are laid out in this webinar. The next webinar that I want to touch on that was done previously, this was back in 2021, is air sealing tips, tricks, and details. This is also located on our YouTube channel. And in an effort to not dive into all of these during this webinar, I just want to point you to that, but I do want to highlight some of the items. And I touch on 5 different areas for air sealing trouble spots. The first one here is wall to ceiling connections. This might be difficult to address after drywall has been installed. So a lot of this has to be, done in a prescribed method, right? We want to make sure that we're sealing areas that are prone to air leakage before finishing, before it's too late. The next one here is penetrations in recessed lighting. This one here kind of looks at, it's addressing 2 things. One, this is a programmable fan that can be used as an exhaust only strategy for whole house mechanical ventilation. But really what I'm looking at here is we are sealing between the drywall and the unit, right, for air infiltration. The next one here is duct boots and chases, and it's crazy the amount of air that leaks between the duct termination point and the flooring level or the ceiling level, just because it doesn't get sealed. The band joist, and this one here is between conditioned and unconditioned transitions. How many, if you want to say I have, you can go ahead and say you have seen this. And if you have a light colored carpet in your house and you walked over and you saw in the intersection of the wall and the carpet a dark, dirty strip between the drywall, it's on the carpet itself. And what's actually happening there is air is leaving or coming in through that area, and it's using the carpet as a filtration system. So that's a big source or indication for a leakage area. All right, so looking here into moisture durability and financial implications, and I'm not necessarily going to be talking about the construction financial implications. I'm going to be talking about medical financial implications. So EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has a document called Moisture Control Guidance for Building Design, Construction, and Maintenance. And in that, it talks about different areas where you can have health-causing problems due to moisture in the area. And you can have prolonged damp conditions can lead to the colonization of building materials and HVA systems by mold, bacteria, wood decay, and insects. Don't have to dive deep into that, but here you can see a picture. This is actually pulled from the document. Even though it does say image source, I believe this was pulled from the document, showing a colonization of mold here in the ceiling wall intersection. Continuing on that same document, it also has high moisture content can cause failures with materials and components. Remember earlier I did mention about the hardwood flooring having defined maximum relative humidity for not just the area in which the product is installed, but also the area that is adjacent to it, which would be the basement. Even though sometimes the home itself or the conditioned space above, the relative humidity might be at a point that's acceptable. The basement could have high relative humidity, which then goes through the subfloor and impacts the hardwood above. So there are many concerns for the building adversely affecting or being affected by high moisture content. In that same EPA document that was published in 2013, the annual medical cost for respiratory illness in the United States is estimated at, for asthma-related medical costs, $3.5 billion. That's a ton of money, right? $3.5 billion for asthma-related medical costs. However, later analysis done by David Marotti in 2016 in his publication titled Valuing the Economic Cost of Allergic Rhinitis, Acute Bronchitis, and Asthma from Exposure to Indoor Dampness and Mold in the US. That's a long title, provides a significantly larger estimate. So that estimate comes in for allergic rhinitis. And if you're not sure what these things are, I did put a slide for medical definitions later on that you can refer back to get that. But rhinitis is an inflammation of the mucous membrane of the nose, typically caused by a virus infection or by an allergic reaction. So that comes in at $3.7 billion. Allergic bronchitis, $1.9 billion. Asthma morbidity. So morbidity is the condition of suffering from a disease or medical condition. So that's having asthma. So it's costing $15.1 billion for having it, and then asthma mortality, which is death by that condition, at 1.7 billion. So that jumps from this document here at 3.5 for just simply asthma to looking at holistically the medical expenses due to poor indoor air quality. Poor indoor air quality at 22 to 24 billion dollars per year, which is, I can't even comprehend that kind of money. It's astronomical. All right, so moving into ways to improve. So we looked at these are concerns of indoor air quality. These are pollutants. These are items that can adversely affect your health. And now let's take a look at how can we improve indoor air quality. So we can improve it by these roughly three basic strategies: source control, improved ventilation, and air cleaners or filtration. She looks like she has very clean indoor air. So the first one here, as you can see, for the bathroom, addressing moisture and biological odors, exhaust fan, right? So introducing an exhaust fan in bathrooms. Kitchen and cooking pollutants. Brett Singer actually he was our Hankin Distinguished Lecturer back in 2020, and his lecture was on indoor air quality, and he really addresses the concern when cooking and the pollutants that cooking does introduce into your structure. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing the link to that recording if that's of interest. And yeah, adding an exhaust fan, a range hood, does help with that. And then looking at your vehicle emissions, separating the house from the garage and those stored chemicals, having a sealed door. It's a code requirement. You have to have an exterior door, it has to be sealed. Moving into anything permitted under the 2021 IRC, has to be that garage door has to be self-closing and self-latching. So that is a new requirement coming forward. And any others, right? Pets. I'm sure a lot of us have pets. Addressing, some of that inadequate indoor air quality or poor indoor air quality through inadequate ventilation or air sealing. Introducing whole house mechanical ventilation systems can help address that. So why inadequate ventilation increases your indoor air quality risks? What happens if too little outdoor air enters the indoors? You have an increased accumulation of pollutants that happen. How does energy efficiency come into play? Well, you look at our codes now, our energy efficiency codes, and we keep tightening up that building thermal envelope. Again, not to repeat it, but that's the most cost-effective way to increase energy efficiency is to tighten up that envelope. But adversely, you have to increase your your ventilation, right? So now moving forward, how does air now enter or leave the dwelling? Does it happen through infiltration? Not necessarily, because we're tightening up that building thermal envelope. Does it happen through natural ventilation? I very, very rarely open my windows in my house, if at all throughout the year. We have conditioned warm and cooling, right? Um, so that doesn't always happen. So now we are moving toward mechanical ventilation. And for all of us code geeks, this is the only code language that I'm going to share today, and it's in regard to the 2021 IRC requirements for whole house mechanical ventilation. And it states that mechanical ventilation has to happen based on sections M1505.4.1 through point 4, but I'm going to focus in on this specific provision, which is 1505.4.1, which is system design. And it says that the whole house ventilation system shall consist of one or more supply or exhaust or a combination of such. Local exhaust or supply fans are permitted to serve as such systems. So, looking at our three strategies, the first one here is exhaust only. I would say, and I know that there were a lot of comments kind of scrolling through the chat, but I would say that the majority of overall, I know that some folks never use this, but overall, this is probably one of the most common strategies selected to achieve the indoor air quality requirement or the whole house mechanical ventilation requirement. This strategy depressurizes the house, right? That's how it works. Remember earlier when we were talking about radon? And radon enters the home due to pressure differences, and this strategy depressurizes the home. That's okay as long as you take additional provisions and measures in that basement to seal that slab and foundation wall. Okay. Some cons is that contaminants may be drawn in from the house through the attic, garage, different crawl spaces. Air may not be distributed throughout the entire house. If you have a point exhaust, right? Oftentimes it's uh, the primary bathroom location. And if those doors are shut, well, you're exhausting air, but you're then drawing the air only in that small area. So, again, just take into account everything that needs to be reviewed. This is often used because it is the lowest initial cost of operation. And here are two examples of what you can use. This is your exhaust fan, and it has to have a programmable feature to it that does ramp up to the required CFM, and then it slows back down to the minimum requirement for, or minimum needed for the size of home that it is. The next strategy here is supply only, and this this pressurizes the house where you have a point entry, and then that air is then distributed throughout the rest of the house. It minimizes contaminants entering through the building. However, if you're in an area like Pennsylvania and in the wintertime, you have the tendency or you have the risk of pushing warm, humid air through the building envelope to the cold sheathing on the outside, which could have some sort of adverse effect due to condensation. If we're looking at the system that could provide the best avenue for indoor air quality when looking at a system, it would be the balanced system. I understand again that it's not going to work for everybody. However, it does limit the pressure imbalances that you can get through the house. This comes about through ERVs and HRVs. And in HRV, the way that it works is you bring in air in and it crosses a plate where it can transfer some of that heat to the incoming air. The exhausting air can transfer some of its heat to the incoming air in the wintertime and vice versa. So it tempers that air coming in. An ERV actually has the ability to transfer both heat and moisture. This system can be installed independently. I know that there are a couple manufacturers out there that have standalone ERV or HRVs. This does come with it the highest cost of installation. However, there are some major benefits that can outweigh that initial onset cost. And here are some examples. And for the sake of time, I will jump right over that. The last thing I'm going to touch on here is the ventilation, right? So as you can see here, filtration, not ventilation, filtration is the often overlooked IAQ strategy. Looking at different MERV ratings, they are described as how the filter captures airborne particles. The higher the MERV rating or the MERV number, the better it is at removing smaller particles. You can look here at your typical ranges. Your MERV 6 to 8 captures large dust and pollen, 9 to 12 captures finer particles and mold spores, and then 13 plus captures very small particles. And once you get to MERV 16, I believe you jump into a HEPA filter. Um, one thing I want to kind of mention is that you can't just automatically take a system, an HVAC system that has a filter in it. Talking about the 1-inch cartridge filter that was designed for using like a MERV 6 and then immediately putting in a MERV 13 because you want better filtration. That will dramatically increase the static pressure of that system, which could have an adverse effect on the system as a whole. Primarily the mechanical part of it, the fan. So I would, if you have any questions on that, I would highly encourage you to reach out to an HVAC technician to see if the system that you have does allow you to increase the MERV rating of the filter without an adverse effect on the system. So ventilation brings outdoor air in, but does not clean it, right? So your whole house mechanical ventilation system, unless you have an ERV or an HRV, does bring air in, but it doesn't necessarily clean it. Outdoor air can contain pollen, smoke, and particles, which are pollutants that can affect your indoor air quality. And without filtration, ventilation can produce contaminants into the living space. Not only do you have to have it when I'm talking about filtration, but you have to properly maintain it, right? You can see here the image on the right has a dirty and a clean filter. That dirty filter probably is not doing a very good job at allowing air to pass through it, and it's probably not doing the best job at filtering out. So there is a maintenance component to this as well. Well, we are 3 minutes past. Sorry about that. But I do want to conclude here with a summary that indoor air quality is a design decision for the assembly. It's not just, we're going to do better indoor air quality. You have to do it as an assembly. So material selection, enclosure detailing, ventilation strategies, and choosing other installations based on your ventilation strategy, right? Most indoor air quality problems start at the source, so pollutants, moisture, and odors are best addressed through source control and air sealing, not after construction, right? Tighter homes, new construction require intentional ventilation. Whatever strategy you choose, make sure that it's a well-designed mechanical ventilation system and look at the entire home holistically. Comfort, health, and durability are all connected, right? Look at drafts, moisture, and poor airflow that impact occupants and shorten building life. Last two things are very, very important here. Effective indoor air quality follows a clear framework. Control the pollutant source. Know what it is, control it. Seal the building enclosure from unwanted pollutants. Ventilate intentionally. That is extremely key, right? It's not an afterthought. It's not checking a box. It needs to be intentional. And filter and maintain indoor air, your indoor air. Finally, here, code establishes a minimum. Design can always do better. So the IRC sets a baseline requirement. Informed design choices can be a significant improvement to the outcomes. Looking at your whole house mechanical ventilation system, there are potentials out there that, like, you know what, maybe I can increase or choose a different strategy that can potentially give a better outcome for indoor air quality for my end user. Addressing radon head on, the code is not required. You're not required by code to introduce any sort of radon mitigation systems. That does not mean you stop there. We want to provide the best we can for our occupants. Here are the medical definitions if you'd like to jump back to them. David, in summary, build tight, ventilate right. That is a terminology, or that is a saying that is out there, right? The old let the house breathe. We want to move away from that, build it tight and ventilate it right. I couldn't agree more.